Ryan Reynolds just told the entire internet to trust legacy media, specifically the New York Times and Time magazine. Those are his examples of reliable, objective journalism that people should be consuming more of instead of trusting independent creators who summarize articles. He called those creators terrifying, his actual word, terrifying. And then, within days of that interview, the New York Times published a new article about Blake Lively's legal case. And when you read it carefully, not skimming the headline, actually reading it, the omissions are so specific and so consistent that they are almost impossible to explain as coincidence. Ryan Reynolds, whose wife's entire legal strategy has relied on controlling media narratives, is maybe not the most credible messenger for a lecture about critical thinking. He then name-dropped Time magazine and the New York Times specifically as examples of trustworthy legacy media. Time magazine, the same publication that listed him as one of the 100 most influential people, the same one where Blake conveniently appeared on a similar list around the same time. And the New York Times, the same outlet that published the original article about Justin Baldoni that Judge Lyman himself later described as involving powerful evidence that Blake coordinated with them before her complaint was even publicly filed. ABC News, that New York Times. Those are Ryan Reynolds' examples of reliable, objective journalism. Welcome to the Marquee Report. Let's go through exactly what the New York Times left out and ask the question Ryan Reynolds does not want you asking. Let's establish what Ryan actually said, because context matters here and his specific word choices matter a lot. Ryan tells Tom Power that we're at this weird moment where legacy media is struggling but doesn't want to admit it. Fine, fair point, honestly. But then he pivots to talking about the TikTok generation and people who summarize articles for others. He actually called that terrifying. Because apparently, people breaking down complicated stories into digestible content is the problem with society right now. ABC News Ryan wonders out loud whether if social media had a critical thinking button, people would even press it. Because in his view, everyone thinks they're a critical thinker, but most people aren't. ABC News step back. The man making this argument is the husband of a woman whose legal team issued subpoenas to over 100 independent creators and journalists. People who were making videos and writing articles about a celebrity legal case suddenly found themselves legally compelled to provide bank records and private communications. The independent creators Ryan is calling terrifying are the exact people his wife's legal team was trying to silence through the legal system. That is not a coincidence worth overlooking. That is the entire context in which this interview happened. Ryan is essentially telling you to trust the outlet that his own wife allegedly worked with to shape a narrative. He's telling you the people breaking that down and pointing it out are the problem. That's not media criticism. That's reputation management dressed up as media criticism. ABC News now, let's go through the New York Times piece, because this is where the story gets genuinely significant. The article frames the central legal question around something called the without malice standard, whether Blake's communications were made in good faith rather than with malicious intent. That framing is accurate. It is the right legal question to focus on. But what the New York Times article completely leaves out is the Vanzam situation. There was a shell company incorporated in September 2024, and its specific purpose was to extract texts via subpoena before Blake's complaint was publicly filed. Judge Lyman himself described this as involving powerful evidence that Blake coordinated with the New York Times before that filing went public. ABC News, read that again. The article is specifically about the without malice question, whether Blake acted in good faith. And Judge Lyman has specifically noted that Blake allegedly coordinated with the New York Times before the complaint was publicly filed. And the New York Times article about the without malice question does not mention any of it. If you're writing an article specifically about the without malice question, and you're writing it for the New York Times, and Judge Lyman has specifically noted that Blake allegedly coordinated with the New York Times, you'd think that might be worth including. They didn't include it, not a single mention. ABC News, that is not an oversight. Reporters at the New York Times do not accidentally omit the specific detail that is most directly relevant to the specific argument their article is making. That is a choice. Here is the second major omission, and this one is almost more revealing because it is so easily verifiable. The New York Times article describes how Judge Lyman dismissed several of Blake's claims. And here is the exact phrasing the paper chose. Legal technicalities. I actually went and read Judge Lyman's ruling specifically around page 108, and what he actually said is significantly more detailed than that. He went through each incident individually. He found that several of the incidents either would not support a hostile work environment claim at all or would do so only minimally in context. The circumcision comment happened before filming even started. The screenplay content was not surprising or unreasonable, given the context of making that specific film. The looking pretty hot example was found insufficient. These weren't technicalities. These were substantive findings. The New York Times reduced all of that to 2 words: ABC News legal technicalities. 2 words. For multiple pages of detailed judicial analysis that went through each incident individually and found the evidence wanting on the substance. That framing is not neutral. Legal technicalities implies the claims would have succeeded if not for procedural obstacles. Substantive findings insufficient on the merits implies something very different. The New York Times chose the former, deliberately, in an article that Ryan Reynolds is asking you to trust. Here is the omission that this channel has covered and that the mainstream media has almost completely ignored. Blake's legal team issued subpoenas to 107 content creators, independent journalist commentators, people covering the story online. They demanded bank records and private communications. The New York Times article talks about how these laws are designed to prevent people from using defamation suits to silence harassment victims. But it says nothing about the subpoenas targeting over 100 journalists and creators. If weaponizing the legal system against people who are just covering a story isn't relevant to a piece about how these laws should and shouldn't be used, I genuinely don't know what is. ABC News 107 subpoenas to independent creators, demanding financial records and private communications from people who were making content about a celebrity legal case. And then Ryan Reynolds goes on a podcast and calls those same creators terrifying for summarizing articles. The independent creators he's dismissing are the ones who read Judge Lyman's actual ruling and noticed it said a lot more than legal technicalities. They're the ones who flagged the Vanzam timeline. They are the ones who noticed Ryan Reynolds wasn't mentioned once in a story where he played a significant role. ABC News, which brings us to the biggest omission of all. The biggest omission in that entire piece is a single name: Ryan Reynolds. The article goes deep into Justin Baldoni's crisis management team. It talks about Blake's associates. It discusses the legal strategies on both sides. But Ryan Reynolds is not mentioned once. ABC News, not his editorial notes on the abuse scenes in the film. Not the alleged calls to WME pushing to get Justin removed. Not the nice guy comment that circulated widely. Not his presence at production meetings he had no official role in. Not the way certain scenes ended up sounding distinctly like his voice rather than Colleen Hoover's. The man who was arguably the most powerful unofficial presence in this entire situation from the very beginning gets completely erased from the New York Times version of events. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's the point. ABC News, because if Ryan Reynolds appears in that article, if his specific actions during production and during the legal fight are documented alongside Justin Baldoni's, the without malice argument becomes significantly more complicated. The good faith framing becomes harder to maintain, so he does not appear in an article about a case where his fingerprints are visible on almost every significant decision. The New York Times erased him, and then he went on a podcast and told you to trust the New York Times. The Time magazine thing genuinely bothers me because it's so brazen. Ryan Reynolds appears on the 100 most influential people list put out by Time magazine. Blake Lively appears on a similar list. Ryan then goes on a podcast and holds up Time magazine as an example of trustworthy journalism we should all be consuming more of. And we're supposed to just not notice that. We're supposed to not apply any critical thinking to the fact that the publication he's praising has financially benefited from access to him and his wife. ABC News, that is not cynicism. That is the most basic application of the critical thinking Ryan claims to want. When a person recommends a publication that has directly benefited from their access and their celebrity, you ask whether the recommendation is genuine or self-serving. The answer here is visible, both of them on influential lists, both outlets receiving favorable coverage. And Ryan on a podcast saying, trust these outlets specifically. That's not a defense of journalism. That's a defense of a particular story. And that distinction matters. ABC News here is where everything lands. Ryan Reynolds told you to think critically and trust legacy media. The legacy media outlet he named then published an article with significant omissions that benefited his wife's legal position. And the people who noticed those omissions, who read the actual ruling, who flagged the Vanzam timeline, who pointed out Ryan's absence from the story, are the independent creators Ryan called terrifying. Deciding for yourself, actually looking at the evidence. Comparing the New York Times summary to Judge Lyman's actual ruling, noticing what got left out, and asking why. That is critical thinking. That's exactly what Ryan said he wanted. ABC News, the critical thinking button is not missing. It is being pressed by the exact people Ryan Reynolds is trying to discredit. And the fact that his wife's legal team subpoenaed over 100 of those people for their bank records tells you everything about how much that critical thinking actually threatens the narrative being constructed. This has been the Marquee Report. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next.